This is Chapter 22 of Jane Eyre. Mr. Rochester had given me but 1 week's leave of absence, yet a month elapsed before I quitted Gateshead. I wished to leave immediately after the funeral, but Georgiana entreated me to stay till she could get off to London, whither she was now at last invited by her uncle, Mr. Gibson, who had come down to direct his sister's interment and settle the family affairs. Georgiana said she dreaded being left alone with Eliza. From her she got neither sympathy in her dejection, support in her fears, nor aid in her preparations. So I bore with her feeble-minded wailings and selfish lamentations as well as I could, and did my best in sewing for her and packing her dresses. It is true that while I worked she would idle, and I thought to myself, if you and I were destined to live always together, cousin, we would commence matters on a different footing. I should not settle tamely down into being the forbearing party. I should assign you your share of labor and compel you to accomplish it, or else it should be left undone. I should insist also on your keeping some of those drawling, half-insincere complaints hushed in your own breast. It is only because our connection happens to be very transitory and comes at a peculiarly mournful season that I consent thus to render it so patient and compliant on my part. So Georgiana asked Jane to stay because she doesn't want to stay alone with Eliza after Mrs. Reed's funeral until she can go to London. And Georgiana kind of like makes Jane do stuff for her, like pack and fold things away. And Jane puts up with it, but thinks that if this were something permanent, she would not. It's only because this comes at a very difficult time of loss for Georgiana. Her mother has just passed away, even though she may not seem to care based on the previous chapter. But because Mrs. Reed has just passed away and this is only a temporary situation, Jane does not say anything about it. At last I saw Georgiana off, but now it was Eliza's turn to request me to stay another week. Her plans required all her time and attention, she said. She was about to depart for some unknown bourne, and all day long she stayed in her own room, her door bolted within, filling trunks, emptying drawers, burning papers, and holding no communication with anyone. She wished me to look after the house, to see callers, and answer notes of condolence. One morning she told me I was at liberty, and she added, I am obliged to you for your valuable services and discreet conduct. There is some difference between living with such an one as you and with Georgiana. You perform your part in life and burden no one. Tomorrow, she continued, I set out for the continent. I shall take up my abode in a religious house near Lisle, a nunnery you would call it. There I shall be quiet and unmolested. I shall devote myself for a time to the examination of the Roman Catholic dogmas and to a careful study of the workings of their system. If I find it to be, as I half suspect it is, the one best calculated to ensure the doing of all things decently and in order, I shall embrace the tenets of Rome and probably take the veil. So Eliza says that her plans, Eliza also asked Jane to stay, and Eliza takes care of whatever business she has, and then Jane takes care of some other household business, and then Eliza says the plan is that she's going to go to Europe, study the Roman Catholic faith, and if that seems to be the most, not the best faith for her, but the one best calculated to ensure the doing of all things decently and in order. So if she thinks that it's the most orderly and proper faith, not that she feels the most spiritually about it, but if it's the most orderly and proper faith, she's going to become a nun. So she's going to take the veil and become a Catholic. So become a Catholic and become a nun. That's what taking the veil means. I neither expressed surprise at this resolution nor attempted to dissuade her from it. The vocation will fit you to a hair, I thought. Much good may it do you. When we parted, she said, Goodbye, Cousin Jane Eyre. I wish you well. You have some sense. I then returned, You are not without sense, Cousin Eliza, but what you have, I suppose, in another year will be walled up alive in a French convent. However, it is not my business, and so it suits you. I don't much care. You are in the right, said she, and with these words we each went our separate way. So not the, kind of like a friendly-ish separation, but not the nicest one. Jane's pretty frank and open with, kind of to each her own philosophy, so that's not Jane's thing, but it will seem to work for Eliza. As I shall not have occasion to refer either to her or her sister again, I may as well mention here that Georgiana made an advantageous match with a wealthy, worn-out man of fashion, and that Eliza actually took the veil, and is at this day superior of the convent where she passed the period of her novitiate, and which she endowed with her fortune. So Eliza ends up as a nun and becomes the superior and the person in charge of that convent, and she also gives that convent her money. And Georgiana made an advantageous match with a wealthy, worn-out man of fashion. So she marries a man who's kind of like run down, probably an older guy, but he's wealthy. So they both have endings that kind of fit with their personality. One of the things that's a popular feature of Victorian literature is this idea of Victorian justice. And it's very much like our concept of karma. So each character kind of gets what they deserve based on their behavior. And we see that here in the middle of the book with the Reeds. So John treats Jane horribly as a child and is cruel, unkind, violent, and he dies in a very unpleasant, horrible way, also with a lot of worry. Mrs. Reed, again, treats Jane horribly and is nasty and cruel to her, even until the very end of her life. And she also has a pretty unsettling death. So she kind of has lost touch with reality, has watched her son pass away quite suddenly, and has lost her family fortune and seen it dwindle. So that's very upsetting. Eliza and Georgiana in the beginning of the book are not nice to Jane, but they're not especially cruel. So they're just kind of generally mean, but they don't do pointed, calculated acts of cruelty, like John throwing the book at Jane and then Mrs. Reed locking Jane in the red room. So their sort of punishment is not really a happy ending, but it's also not like a severe reprimand. So Eliza ends up with something that seems to work for her, although Jane doesn't think of that as a particularly happy life, and the same thing can be said of Georgiana. So watch for that in Jane Eyre, but also any work of Victorian literature. You see the good characters being rewarded and the wicked characters being punished. It's not true of every work of Victorian literature, but many of them do have this idea that the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. How people feel when they are returning home from an absence, long or short, I did not know. I had never experienced the sensation. I had known what it was to come back to Gateshead when a child after a long walk, to be scolded for looking cold or gloomy, and later what it was to come back from church to Lowood, to long for a plenteous meal and a good fire, and to be unable to get either. Neither of these returnings was very pleasant or desirable. No magnet drew me to a given point, increasing in its strength of attraction the nearer I came. The return to Thornfield was yet to be tried. My journey seemed tedious, very tedious. 50 miles one day, a night spent at an inn, 50 miles the next day. During the first 12 hours, I thought of Mrs. Reed in her last moments. I saw her disfigured and discolored face, and heard her strangely altered voice. I mused on the funeral day, the coffin, the hearse, the black train of tenants and servants, few as a number of relatives, the gaping vault, the silent church, the solemn service. Then I thought of Eliza and Georgiana. I beheld one the cynosure of a ballroom, the other the inmate of a convent cell, and I dwelt on and analyzed their separate peculiarities of person and character. The evening arrival at the great town of scattered these thoughts. Night gave them quite another turn. Laying down on my traveller's bed, I left reminiscence for anticipation. I was going back to Thornfield, but how long was I to stay there? Not long, of that I was sure. I had heard from Mrs. Fairfax in the interim of my absence. The party at the hall was dispersed. Mr. Rochester had left for London 3 weeks ago, but he was then expected to return in a fortnight. Mrs. Fairfax surmised that he was gone to make arrangements for his wedding, as he had talked of purchasing a new carriage. She said the idea of his marrying Miss Ingram still seemed strange to her, but from what everybody said, and from what she had herself seen, she could no longer doubt that the event would shortly take place. You would be strangely incredulous if you did doubt it, was my mental comment. I don't doubt it. The question followed, where was I to go? I dreamt of Miss Ingram all the night. In a vivid morning dream, I saw her closing the gates of Thornfield against me and pointing me out another road, and Mr. Rochester looked on with his arms folded, smiling sardonically, as it seemed, at both her and me. So Jane has this dream when she's at the inn. She's a day away from Thornfield, and her dream is that Blanche Ingram shuts the gates of Thornfield on her and like points her how to leave, and then Mr. Rochester is just kind of standing there with his arms crossed, but he's smiling sardonically, so kind of like sarcastically at her, both her and Blanche. So that's a strange one. I had not notified to Mrs. Fairfax the exact day of my return, for I did not wish either car or carriage to meet me at Millcote. I proposed to walk the distance quietly by myself, and very quietly, after leaving my box in the ostler's care, did I slip away from the George Inn about 6 o'clock of a June evening, and take the old road to Thornfield, a road which lay chiefly through fields, and was now little frequented. It was not a bright or splendid summer evening, though fair and soft. The haymakers were at work all along the road, and the sky, though far from cloudless, was such as promised well for the future. Its blue, where blue was visible, was mild and settled, and its cloud strata high and thin. The west, too, was warm, no watery gleam chilled it. It seemed as if there was a fire lit, an altar burning behind its screen of marbled vapor, and out of apertures shone a golden redness. I felt glad as the road shortened before me, so glad that I stopped once to ask myself what that joy meant, and to remind reason that it was not to my home I was going, or to a permanent resting place, or to a place where fond friends looked out for me and waited my arrival. Mrs. Fairfax will smile you a calm welcome, to be sure, said I, and little Adele will clap her hands and jump to see you. But you know very well you are thinking of another than they, and that he is not thinking of you. But what is so headstrong as youth? What so blind as inexperience? These affirmed that it was pleasure enough to have the privilege of again looking on Mr. Rochester, whether he looked on me or not, and they added, hasten, hasten, be with him while you may, but a few more days or weeks at most, and you are parted from him forever. And then I strangled a newborn agony, a deformed thing which I could not persuade myself to own and rear, and ran on. So Jane's excited about going back to Thornfield, and she does consider it to be more of a home than either Lowood or Gateshead. She's feeling more happiness than she did on those return journeys. But she knows that the main reason for her happiness is that Mr. Rochester's at Thornfield, and she has to really stop herself and, tell herself that that's not a healthy thing to do because Mr. Rochester does not like her in return. They are making hay too in Thornfield Meadows, or rather the laborers are just quitting their work and returning home with their rakes on their shoulders, now at the hour I arrive. You'll notice again this paragraph that we're switching into present tense, so something exciting is going to happen. I have but a field or two to traverse, and then I shall cross the road and reach the gates. How full the hedges are of roses! But I have no time to gather any. I want to be at the house. I pass a tall briar, shooting leafy and flowery branches across the path. I see the narrow stile with stone steps, and I see Mr. Rochester sitting there, a book and a pencil in his hand. He is writing. Well, he is not a ghost, yet every nerve I have is unstrung. For a moment I am beyond my own mastery. What does it mean? I did not think I should tremble in this way when I saw him, or lose my voice or the power of motion in his presence. I will go back as soon as I can stir. I need not make an absolute fool of myself. I know another way to the house. It does not signify if I knew 20 ways, for he has seen me. Hello, he cries, and he puts up his book and his pencil. There you are, come on if you please. I suppose I do come on, though in what fashion I know not, being scarcely cognizant of my movements, and solicitous only to appear calm, and above all, to control the working muscles of my face, which I feel rebel insolently against my will, and struggle to express what I had resolved to conceal. But I have a veil, it is down. I may make shift yet to behave with decent composure. So Jane sees Mr. Rochester. She thinks about going a different way so that she doesn't have to run into him. Doesn't matter. He sees her, and she's trying not to freak out. And this is Jane. Are you coming from Millcote and on foot? Yes, just one of your tricks, not to send for a carriage and come clattering over street and road like a common mortal, but to steal into the vicinage of your home along with twilight, just as if you were a dream or a shade. What the deuce have you done with yourself this last month? I have been with my aunt, sir, who is dead. A true Janie in reply, good angels be my guard. She comes from the other world, from the abode of people who are dead, and tells me so when she meets me alone here in the gloaming. If I dared, I'd touch you to see if you are a substance or shadow, you elf. But I'd as soon offer to take hold of a blue ignis fatuus light in a marsh. Truant, he added, while he had paused an instant. Absent from me a whole month, and forgetting me quite, I'll be sworn. So Mr. Rochester, again, is making the joke that Jane is a fairy or elf creature, or some sort of supernatural creature, and he says, oh, you're with your dead aunt, just like you, coming back from the realm of the dead people. And then he goes on to say that he would touch her to make sure she's real, but it would be like following a will-o'-the-wisp, one of those blue lights that appear from natural phenomena, and they're not really there and are known for misleading travelers. And then he says, oh, you've been gone for a month, you'll probably forget about me totally. I knew there would be pleasure in meeting my master again, even though broken by the fear that he was so soon to cease to be my master, and by the knowledge that I was nothing to him. But there was ever in Mr. Rochester, so at least I thought, such a wealth of the power of communicating happiness, that to taste but of the crumbs he scattered to stray and stranger birds like me was to feast genially. His last words were balm. They seemed to imply that it imported something to him, whether I forgot him or not. And he had spoken of Thornfield as my home. Would that it were my home. So the fact that he's worried about her forgetting him, she takes as a good sign. And he talked about Thornfield like it was her home, and Jane wishes that it were. He did not leave the stile, and I hardly liked to ask to go by. I inquired soon if he had not been to London. Yes, I suppose you found that out by second sight. Mrs. Fairfax told me in a letter. And did she inform you what I went to do? Oh, yes, sir. Everybody knew your errand. You must see the carriage, Jane, and tell me if you don't think it will suit Mrs. Rochester exactly, and whether she won't look like Queen Boadicea leaning back against those purple cushions. I wish, Jane, I were a trifle better adapted to match with her externally. Tell me now, fairy as you are, can't you give me a charm or a philter or something of that sort to make me a handsome man? It would be past the power of magic, sir, and in thought I added, loving eyes all the charm needed. To such you are handsome enough, or rather your sternness has a power beyond beauty. So out loud, Jane says this very kind of awful reply. So he asks her jokingly, oh, don't you have some sort of fairy charm that'll make me look like a handsome guy? And Jane says it's not possible. But then she adds that you don't really need a charm if someone who loves you is looking at you. And that's all there is. Also that he has a sternness beyond, his sternness has a power beyond beauty. So it doesn't matter whether he's handsome or ugly, but he has that sort of like magnetism.